Most damage dealers in Star Rail currently deal their damage directly to the enemy. However, there is a small subset of characters who do this indirectly through damage over time effects. In general, dot damage hasn't really been front and center since the release of the game. You can use it if you enjoy its mechanics, but there hasn't really been a reason to focus on it until now. With Kafka's recent release, we now have the first 5-star dot enabler that, based on her kit, will surely make dot DPS have a more prominent role as one of the game's premier damage dealers. But is this really the case? Before we dive into Kafka's viability, if you want to see more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Kafka is likely the most anticipated character to be released, both because of her design and role within the main story, as well as her dot-focused kit. Many will likely summon for her because most will fall on either side of this reasoning, as some of you might just really like her character and design, while those of you who like dot characters may summon for her due to her unique dot-enabling kit. So there's a reason for both meta chasers and waifu followers to consider this banner. But let's take a step back and examine her kit in general and see what she can exactly do and how much will she actually benefit dot characters. The way dot damage works is that once you've applied the dot debuff, you need to wait for the enemy's turn for them to receive the damage. Kafka's skill basically allows you to trigger dot damage when an enemy gets hit by it. The skill deals lightning damage to a main target and reduce damage to the adjacent targets. The skill will also then trigger all the damage from any dots that the main target has applied to them at a 75% efficiency rate. This means that you don't have to wait for the enemy's turn for the dot to do its damage, and with Kafka's skill, you can trigger it much earlier. Another way of seeing this is the more dots an enemy or target has, the more damage Kafka's skill will do, and when the enemy takes their turn, they will still receive another instance of damage from the dot stack. So it doesn't really mean that you are buffing dot damage, but rather giving it another instance in which it can proc and deal damage. Let's talk about her ultimate next. Now, if you've seen some older Kafka videos like from the beta or something, you might have heard that Kafka can buff dot damage, and this is why you might hear some takes on why Kafka is a must-have for dot DPS/support. In the past, this was the case because her ultimate had a dot vulnerability debuff attached to it, but it has now since been changed. The way her ultimate works right now is that it focuses more on applying and triggering dots. When activated, she will do damage to all enemies and have a 100% base chance to apply shock, as well as immediately force the enemy to take damage from those shock dots. While they are shocked, the enemies also receive lightning dot damage that scale off of Kafka's own attack, which basically means the shock dots she applies does more damage than normal. Once you have Ascension 2, the ultimate also functions like her skill, allowing you to trigger all other sources of dot damage in a single instance to all enemies. So while she no longer can buff dot damage, this makes her a more self-sustaining character, in the sense that she can apply shock dots herself and without waiting for the enemy's turn, trigger them to cause more damage. This is quite evident when you look at her talent as well, which is basically a follow-up attack that applies more shock on enemies. All in all, her playstyle likely revolves around applying dots and then forcibly triggering those dots through her skill and ultimate. Personally, I don't think it's such a terrible change because it just means that the dots applied to an enemy has more frequency in dealing damage. Without Kafka, you'd have to wait for the enemy's turn for it to trigger, but with Kafka, you can force the damage to trigger using her skill, her ultimate, and when it's the enemy's turn again, it gets triggered another time. This makes dot damage, I suppose, slightly more reliable as there are now 3 situations where they can trigger instead of just one. So in a way, Kafka does benefit pretty much all dot teams by making the frequency of damage happen more often. On top of that, Kafka's ability to forcibly trigger dot damage can be considered as unique, since no other character right now is able to do this. We don't know if in the future other characters will have this functionality, and if not, then Kafka may likely be the most important character to have if you plan on running dot teams. Now this doesn't mean that Kafka doesn't have any issues. Firstly is that while Kafka can self-sustain shock dots, the nature of dots itself sort of requires you to have another elemental dot applier like Sampo, Hook, or Luca to further supplement the damage overall. The reason is because that you cannot infinitely apply dot stacks on enemies, so if you only have Kafka on your team, Her damage is sort of capped in a sense, as once you have fully applied the maximum number of shock on the enemy, you can't apply any more, and the damage does not increase any further. Another issue is that Kafka herself cannot buff dot damage, and is something only Sampo can do right now, as he applies dot vulnerability through his ultimate. So with the current roster, any team with Kafka is almost always going to have Sampo there as well, to maximize dot damage overall, which then limits the types of teams you can actually run. This is a problem now because we don't have many other characters that function using dot, so in the future, as more characters get released, this issue may likely go away. While the damage from dots could be potentially high, it's not currently game-breaking, as most dot appliers we have right now are 4-star characters. So moving forward, as we get more 5-star dot characters, the team damage overall will likely go up. Whether or not you should summon for Kafka is truthfully quite a subjective thing. She doesn't appear to be one of those characters that works well in any team and can be slotted anywhere, as she seems to only be valuable in dot-based teams. She can self-sustain her own shock dots and act as a sub-DPS, but I would imagine in order to maximize her damage and value, running her in a dot team comp would be the most ideal. The dot playstyle is also an acquired taste, and some of you may not like the playstyle, and if so, I doubt Kafka alone is going to change your mind. All in all, I think that Kafka is one of those characters that depends on you, as if you enjoy the dot style gameplay, then she likely is a pretty good pickup, if not a critical one. Otherwise, I don't think you absolutely need her, as she doesn't seem to be very flexible and might not fit too well in other types of team comps. You could still run her in whatever team you want, but again, she likely shines the best in dot-focused teams. Now, all of this doesn't matter if you want to summon her purely because of her story or lore, and don't let me change your mind if that's your reasoning. The banners in 1.3 are also something you might want to consider. If Imbibitor Lunae wasn't coming out right after this banner, I personally would summon for Kafka myself, as I do enjoy using dot damage occasionally. If you're really unsure and are kinda on the fence about Kafka, then perhaps wait a few more days and see what the theory crafting community has to say about her performance. Again, this doesn't really matter if you're just interested in her because of her design or lore. Let me know in the comments whether you will personally summon for her and why. I'll end the video here, and if you found the video helpful or entertaining, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.